an incredibly heavy, really complex, and just uncompromising text on the table today. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. This is definitely going to be an intense one.
Yeah, it really is. Before we map out the specific architecture of today's deep dive, please take a second to hit that like button and subscribe.
Right. It is the single best way to ensure we can keep bringing you these really in-depth, long-form analyses week after week.
Exactly. So today we are opening up a 2026 release that has sent absolute shockwaves through its target demographic.
No massive shockwaves.
The book is titled Karen Whistle, The Resentment, Hate, Lies, Suicidal Empathy, and Hysteria Flywheel. And it's by an author named Conrad Riker.
It's quite a title.
It is.
Yeah.
Now, if you consider yourself an advocate for men's rights, or, if you are plugged into the broader conversations happening within the manosphere, this specific analysis is tailored directly for you.
Yeah, Riker's stated goal in this text is basically to provide a comprehensive, red-pilled roadmap.
Right. He wants to help you understand the foundational history of modern Western institutions, specifically how they functioned, according to him, before they experienced what he calls a complete ideological capture by feminists and Marxists.
And we should mention right up front, if our breakdown today hooks you and you want to examine the primary source for yourself, you can go check Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books right now to buy the ebook.
Yep, it's available there. And for those who want to follow the author's ongoing dispatches, you can find him at the handle at Conrad Riker on Substack.
So we're essentially dealing with a text that functions as, well, it's both a philosophical diagnosis and an escape manual.
An escape manual, yeah, that's a good way to put it.
But before we get into the actual mechanics of that diagnosis, we absolutely need to establish a very firm boundary for you, the listener.
A crucial disclaimer.
Exactly. The text we are analyzing today contains highly politically charged, deeply controversial, and explicitly right-wing content. The rhetoric used to frame modern social dynamics is aggressive. It is uncompromising.
Very uncompromising.
And our job today is strictly to act as impartial guides. We are not taking sides here.
Now,
And we are not endorsing the viewpoints, the philosophy, or the political conclusions drawn by the author.
our sole mission is just to dissect the arguments, map out the ideological frameworks, and examine the historical touchstones the author uses to build his case.
Right, so you can objectively understand the architecture of his claims without us putting our thumb on the scale.
That neutrality is critical because, honestly, the scope of Riker's argument is massive.
It covers everything: economics, law, psychology.
Right. We can think of the structure of this book almost like an escape room or maybe a heist movie. Riker is attempting to show his readers that they are trapped in a system, then he is identifying the guards of that system, and finally he points toward the exit.
So let's start with the nature of the trap itself. The foundational premise of Karen Whistle rests on this sweeping civilizational dichotomy.
On one side, Riker places what he calls the logos.
Yeah, the logos. And he defines this not just as logic, but as the divine objective reason that structures the cosmos.
Right. In his framework, the logos represents the masculine principle. It's about order, rigid hierarchy, empirical truth.
And he argues that this is the specific operating system that men utilize to build Western civilization.
Oh, right. The engineering, the infrastructure, the medical breakthroughs, all of it. The rule of law.
The contrast he sets up against the logos is what he terms a modern gynocentric order.
Gynocentric meaning centered around women.
Exactly. And he defines this opposing force as being driven entirely by pathos: emotion, subjectivity, empathy, and ultimately resentment.
Resentment is a huge theme for him.
It is. Riker's core assertion here is that this gynocentric order is not interested in coexisting with the logos. Rather, it is actively and systematically dismantling.
And by dismantling the masculine principle of order, he argues it's dismantling civilization itself.
What makes his approach to this so striking is that he doesn't just, blame modern social media dynamics. He digs deep into mid-20th century political philosophy.
Right. He specifically points to the Frankfurt School to explain the origin of this ideological shift.
He zeroes in on a very specific text from 1965. It's an essay by Herbert Marcuse called Repressive Tolerance.
Riker actually elevates this essay to the status of a tactical Bible for the modern progressive left.
He does. Most people listening might be familiar with the modern buzzwords of social justice, but Riker is telling his readers, look, if you want to understand why the rules feel rigged against you today, you have to read Marcuse.
The way Riker utilizes Marcuse is a fascinating rhetorical inversion. because Marcuse was a prominent Marxist philosopher associated with the New Left.
Right. In Repressive Tolerance, Marcuse argued that in a highly unequal society, traditional objective tolerance, meaning tolerating all viewpoints equally, actually just serves to reinforce the oppressive status quo.
So to achieve true liberation, Marcuse posited that society must practice a liberating tolerance.
And what did that specifically mean? It meant extending absolute limitless tolerance to left-wing, revolutionary, and marginalized movements while simultaneously being entirely intolerant of right-wing, reactionary, or traditionalist movements.
Marcuse explicitly argued for the withdrawal of free speech and assembly rights from groups promoting what he viewed as oppressive policies.
Exactly. And Riker takes that academic theory from 1965 and maps it directly onto the 2026 cultural landscape.
He is telling his audience that they are not experiencing hypocrisy. They are experiencing Marcuse's philosophy operating exactly as intended.
He uses this to explain the glaring double standards in modern institutions.
Right. According to Riker's framework, this is why a feminist professor can post extremely aggressive, hostile rhetoric about men on social media and retain her university tenure.
While a man in corporate America can be instantly terminated for simply stating that biological differences exist between the sexes.
The system is not malfunctioning. That's his point. It is enforcing a one-way ratchet of tolerance designed to protect the gynocentric ideology while ruthlessly silencing any expression of the masculine logos.
And he traces the enforcement of that ratchet straight into the intellectual bedrock of academia.
Riker is fiercely critical of modern universities.
Fiercely. He argues that they have fundamentally abandoned the pursuit of objective truth, essentially functioning as ideological compliance centers.
To illustrate this, he contrasts two distinct ways of understanding reality. First, he points to Aristotle's law of non-contradiction,
which is the absolute foundational rule of Western logic. It states A is A, and A cannot be non-A at the same time and in the same respect.
Right. A thing cannot be true and false simultaneously. This is the bedrock of the scientific method and empirical observation.
But Riker claims that universities, driven specifically by humanities and gender studies departments, have systematically replaced Aristotle with a framework called standpoint epistemology.
For anyone not deep into academic theory, let's unpack that term. Epistemology is simply the study of how we know what we know.
And Riker argues that standpoint epistemology is the idea that an individual's designated position within a hierarchy of oppression grants them a special, unassailable access to truth.
In this model, subjective feelings, the lived experience of a designated victim, actually override empirical data and constitute objective reality.
The implication of that shift is profound when applied to law and culture, which is exactly where Riker takes it.
If a woman subjectively feels harassed or threatened under the framework of standpoint epistemology, a transgression has objectively occurred.
Regardless of the empirical facts, the intent or standard due process, the feeling itself generates the reality.
Riker views this not as a progression toward a more empathetic society, but as a severe regression.
He likens it to a form of pre-rational animism, a state where logic and empirical evidence are routinely sacrificed at the altar just to appease the subjective emotional state of a specific demographic.
That epistemic shift moving from objective logic to subjective emotion sets the stage for one of the most provocative claims in the book.
Yes, the evolutionary psychology argument.
Exactly. Riker uses evolutionary psychology to explain the aggressive behavior he observes in modern feminism. He introduces the concept of the shit test,
which is a term quite familiar within the manosphere, but he applies it on a massive macro-civilizational scale.
In evolutionary psychology models, the theory often posits that women are biologically wired to periodically test a man's strength, emotional resilience, and ability to maintain boundaries.
The evolutionary purpose of this test is to ensure the man is a capable protector who won't crumble under pressure.
And Riker extrapolates this interpersonal dynamic and applies it to modern cultural movements.
He posits that much of the irrational demands, the manufactured outrage, and the hysterical rhetoric of modern feminism is, on an unconscious biological level, a massive evolutionary test directed at the masculine structure of society.
The unconscious question being asked is, are you strong enough to enforce reality? Are you strong enough to say no?
The tragedy of the modern West, according to Riker, is that Western men have collectively failed this test.
Rather than standing firm in the logos and enforcing boundaries, he argues that men have apologized, acquiesced, and continuously yielded ground.
Because society failed to provide that strong, unyielding masculine no, Riker claims that women have unconsciously lost respect for male authority.
He argues that this lack of resistance is what causes the demands to become increasingly irrational and destructive.
ultimately leading to the crumbling of civilizational stability.
If the failure to maintain the logos is the trap, then we need to look at how the gynocentric system actively polices its boundaries.
Which brings us directly to the title of the book, Karen Whistle, and how Riker defines the Karen.
He does not treat this term as a joke.
Not at all. He strips away all the internet meme culture surrounding the Karen, the viral videos of women complaining about expired coupons, and he elevates the archetype to the status of a brutal political enforcement mechanism.
The language he uses here is incredibly dark. He refers to the Karen as the capo of the gynocentric gulag.
To fully grasp the weight of that comparison, a capo was a prisoner in a Nazi concentration camp who was assigned by the SS guards to supervise forced labor or carry out administrative tasks.
It is an extreme historical parallel.
Very extreme. And Riker uses it to argue that the Karen operates as a low-level, decentralized informant,
She is the neighborhood hall monitor, the HR busybody, the HOA enforcer.
whose entire societal function is to keep the totalitarian machinery humming by reporting wrongthink and utilizing her emotional state to summon institutional violence against men.
Riker details exactly how this enforcement operates through what he calls the syllogistic anatomy of the shriek.
He contrasts classical debate with the weaponization of the Karen whistle.
An argument, built on the logos, requires a logical progression from promises to a conclusion. It requires the rational assent of the listener's mind. You have to persuade someone.
The whistle, however, the high decibel shriek of manufactured performative outrage, is designed to bypass the rational mind entirely.
It skips the premise and the argument, proceeding straight from an emotional state to a demanded consequence.
And that consequence is almost always the complete social and economic destruction of the target.
He describes it almost like an acoustic biological weapon. He points out that biologically, the human ear has no eyelid.
You cannot instinctively block out a high-pitched hysterical scream. It hits your nervous system immediately, triggering a stress response.
Historically, the only defense against that kind of sonic emotional attack was physical distance. But Riker argues that modern technology has completely removed distance as a defense.
Social media algorithms, which are explicitly designed to optimize for outrage, negative emotion, and engagement, act as massive amplifiers for the whistle.
The digital architecture of platforms like Twitter or TikTok essentially mainlines the Banshee's wail directly into the cultural bloodstream.
Because that specific frequency of hysteria generates billions of dollars in advertising revenue.
Riker grounds this theoretical framework in highly specific, recognizable cultural touchstones. He points to viral incidents that most of his target audience will immediately recall.
He dissects the infamous Screaming Girl incident at Yale University, where a student was filmed screaming hysterically at a professor who was calmly trying to discuss the logic of Halloween costume guidelines.
He brings up incidents like the woman who called the police on an African-American man for barbecuing in a park.
Riker insists that society makes a fatal error by dismissing these as isolated, embarrassing emotional meltdowns or mental health crises.
Right. He views them as highly effective public exorcisms of logic.
When the Karen blows the whistle, she is invoking the deputies of masculine power. She calls the police, she summons corporate management, she tags the CEO on social media.
She's directing the physical and institutional force built by men to act as a weapon against the masculine principle itself.
She summons the authority, watches the punishment of the target, and derives a massive dopamine hit of moral superiority and power. It is an exercise in asserting dominance over reality.
And this weaponization of emotion finds its most potent, formalized institutional expression in corporate America.
Riker dedicates a significant portion of his analysis to dissecting the modern human resources department.
He synthesizes how HR operates, likening it less to an administrative function and more to a religious inquisition.
To illustrate this, he dissects the highly publicized 2017 case of James Damore, the software engineer fired from Google.
For context, Damore wrote an internal memo citing peer-reviewed evolutionary psychology and biological research to suggest that differences in personality traits and interests might partially explain the gender disparity in the tech industry.
It was an argument grounded entirely in empirical data and the logos. But Riker points out that the institutional response was not a logical counterargument.
Google did not produce a white paper refuting his data.
Exactly the opposite. The response was the whistle. Employees declared they felt unsafe simply being in the same building as the memo.
Riker notes that the corporation didn't point to a specific objective violation of a behavioral policy. They cited a violation of values and terminated him.
Riker categorizes this as the corporate capitulation algorithm. Here is how the formula works.
An accusation is made, the whistle blast of manufactured outrage is deployed on internal networks or social media, and the employee is swiftly fired without due process or chance to defend the logic of his statement.
Simply to appease the emotional hysteria of the collective hive.
The actual content of the dissenting speech is entirely irrelevant in this algorithm.
The mere existence of dissent, the audacity to introduce the logos into a space governed by pathos, is treated as heresy.
And the HR department serves as the mechanism that delivers the heretic to the flames, effectively cleansing the corporation of any masculine resistance.
This systemic purging of male resistance relies on a profound psychological mechanism that Riker diagnoses as suicidal empathy.
If the trap is the gynocentric system and the guards are the Karens, suicidal empathy is the psychological conditioning that convinces the prisoners to lock their own cell doors.
Riker describes this as a fundamental biological vulnerability inherent in men, the noble, deeply ingrained evolutionary instinct to protect women from harm and alleviate their distress.
He argues that in the modern era, this protective instinct has been expertly weaponized against men.
Through relentless cultural conditioning in media, education, and entertainment, men have been convinced that protecting women means willingly legislating away their own rights, their own spaces, and the future prospects of their sons.
It is a psychological warfare operation where a man's own shield is continually used to bash his head in.
Riker says that men are constantly told to be good, to be allies, but the modern definition of good has been entirely rewritten.
It's been rewritten to mean acting as a docile lamb, willingly led to the slaughterhouse of their own disenfranchisement.
That weaponization of empathy creates a profound society-wide cognitive dissonance. Riker brilliantly captures this paradox with the term Schrodinger's agency.
Taking the concept from quantum mechanics, Schrödinger's cat being simultaneously alive and dead until observed, Riker applies this to the contradictory narrative modern culture constructs around women.
He points out that society demands its citizens simultaneously hold two mutually exclusive states of female existence in their minds without questioning the friction.
Let's map out that paradox. On one hand, the cultural narrative demands absolute reverence for the girl boss.
This is the archetype of an omnipotent, fiercely independent, highly capable deity who can run Fortune 500 companies, command military units, and needs absolutely no assistance, guidance, or protection from men.
But on the very same hand, the exact moment a woman faces adversity, professional criticism, or the negative consequences of her own choices, the narrative instantly flips.
She is immediately reframed as a fragile, wilting victim who has been deeply traumatized by microaggressions, structural biases, or incorrect pronouns.
The utility of Schrödinger's agency for the gynocentric system is that it creates an unfalsifiable narrative,
which is a hallmark of cult logic.
It allows the system to claim all the spoils of success, competence, and power as evidence of inherent female superiority,
while simultaneously externalizing all failure, accountability, and eroticism onto an invisible, omnipresent scapegoat.
The patriarchy.
Exactly. Riker argues that this paradox effectively strips women of what he calls the dignity of consequences.
He brings some incredibly intense receipts from the legal system to illustrate how this stripping of consequences plays out in reality.
He points to the courtroom to show how society artificially insulates women from the logos of justice.
He uses the Jodi Arias trial as a prime example.
Arias premeditated a horrific, brutal murder. She stabbed her ex-boyfriend 29 times, slit his throat, and shot him in the head.
Yet, despite the cold, calculated nature of the crime, her defense team's strategy leaned heavily on claiming battered woman syndrome.
They attempted to utilize Schrödinger's agency, painting her as the ultimate fragile victim of male abuse to escape accountability for a meticulously planned slaughter.
He also brings up cases like Deborah LaFive, a schoolteacher who engaged in the statutory rape of a 14-year-old boy.
Her defense attorney famously argued to the judge that she was too pretty for prison, leaning entirely on the protective instincts of suicidal empathy.
She walked away with probation without spending a single second behind bars.
Riker looks at these glaring disparities in the justice system and argues that this leniency is not a form of societal mercy.
By placing women on this artificial, consequence-free pedestal, society treats them like overgrown toddlers who are fundamentally incapable of governing their own moral impulses,
while simultaneously handing them the steering wheel of the entire civilization. It is a recipe for catastrophic systemic failure.
The analysis then shifts from the psychological and legal realms into hard economics.
If we're mapping out the escape room, This is where Riker explains how the prison is funded.
He explores this under the concept of the parasite's logic. He bluntly asserts that the modern welfare state does not function as a safety net. It functions primarily as a massive, gendered wealth transfer mechanism.
To anchor this highly controversial claim, he turns to economic data, specifically citing a comprehensive 2013 study conducted by the UK's Taxpayers Alliance.
According to the analysis of this data, men pay roughly 72% of the net income tax in the United Kingdom, while women pay only 28%.
He supplements this with references to similar studies conducted by the New Zealand government.
Riker interprets this macroeconomic data to argue a stark class division.
He defines men as a demographic bloc as net positive contributors. Over their lifetimes, they pay significantly more capital into the state apparatus than they consume in services.
Conversely, he categorizes women as a demographic bloc as net negative taxpayers.
Over their lifetimes, through greater utilization of healthcare, education, welfare, and state pensions, they consume vastly more government resources than they contribute in taxes. Based on this interpretation, Riker concludes that the modern state is effectively an extraction machine.
It leverages the threat of institutional violence, the IRS, the police, to forcibly move resources from the pockets of hardworking men, whom he labels the host class,
directly to the parasite class of women, who reliably utilize their voting majority to demand even higher taxes and greater state expansion to subsidize their consumption.
This economic critique seamlessly extends into his analysis of corporate diversity, equity, and inclusion programs.
Riker entirely dismisses the notion that DEI is driven by a moral imperative for fairness.
He rebrands DEI initiatives as corporate damsel in distress protocols.
The underlying premise of these programs, he argues, is the complaint that women are being oppressed by the ruthless, subjective, meritocratic nature of the free market, the logos.
In response to this complaint, the modern corporation plays the role of the white knight.
It steps in to forcefully engineer equity by mandating hiring quotas and diversity targets.
Riker argues that this dynamic fundamentally forces the free market to artificially subsidize female employment and vast layers of administrative bloat.
More perniciously, he claims it actively handicaps male competence, denying promotions and positions to highly qualified men simply to balance a spreadsheet.
He views DEI as the institutional enshrinement of mediocrity, driven entirely by the host-parasite economic dynamic.
This extraction of resources isn't just limited to the tax code or corporate HR departments. Riker argues it has evolved into a hyper-efficient digital architecture.
He explores this in a scathing chapter on what he dubs the simp economy.
He looks at platforms like OnlyFans, Twitch, and various social media ecosystems, and he does not see them as neutral technological innovations or harmless entertainment.
He views them as the financial superstructures of a gynocentric digital prison. Let's break down how he thinks this prison operates.
These platforms are designed to extract capital from a very specific demographic, lonely, disenfranchised men.
Men who have been progressively deprived of actual physical community, profound purpose, and real-world intimacy.
In exchange for their hard-earned resources, these men receive absolutely nothing of tangible value. They receive what Riker calls, or sets, parasocial intimacy.
For those unfamiliar, parasocial refers to a one-sided relationship where one person extends emotional energy, interest, and time, while the other party is completely unaware of their existence. It's an illusion of connection.
It is a brilliantly engineered economic engine fueled entirely by the desperation of men relegated to the bottom of the modern sexual and social hierarchy.
They are continually transferring their wealth to women who offer them nothing but digital pixels and the simulation of attention in return.
Riker urges his readers to wake up and break out of this digital estrogen loop.
He advises men to view their smartphones not as communication devices, but as highly advanced personal hypnotists.
These devices are meticulously programmed to stroke the amygdala, keeping men docile, continuously agitated, and systematically financially drained.
Riker argues that this docility isn't just a byproduct of technology, it is actively programmed into men from childhood.
This brings us to his chapter on the war on boys.
Riker claims that the modern public education system is not a place of intellectual development, but rather a factory explicitly designed to geld the male spirit before it can mature into a threat to the gynocentric order.
He focuses on the physical reality of the modern classroom. Schools require children to sit perfectly still in a sedentary, highly structured, feminine-conforming environment for up to 8 hours a day.
When young boys naturally exhibit the kinetic energy, rough-and-tumble aggression, and physical drive inherent to their biology, the system does not accommodate them.
It doesn't give them more recess or hands-on learning. Instead, the system pathologizes their natural behavior.
He argues that we diagnose boys with ADHD at astronomically higher rates than girls, entirely treating male biology as a psychiatric disorder.
And the solution is to drug them. We mandate powerful stimulants like Ritalin and Adderall.
Riker views this pharmacological intervention as a literal chemical castration of the nascent logos.
The ultimate goal of the education system, in his view, is to take potentially dangerous, highly energetic future protectors and chemically suppress them until they become compliant, medicated drones.
Drones who will grow up to quietly pay their taxes to fund the matriarchy without ever developing the spirit required to question the narrative.
This trajectory of pathologization and suppression leads us to what is undoubtedly the darkest, most controversial, and ideologically extreme section of the text.
Chapter 8, which Riker deliberately and provocatively titles Men Kampf, the Rhetoric of Extermination.
In this section, Riker advances the argument that modern intersectional feminist rhetoric bears deeply uncomfortable structural similarities to the paranoid, eliminationist conspiracy theories of the early 20th century.
Let's walk through how he constructs that terrifying parallel. He posits that if you examine the core texts of modern critical theory and simply replace the terms referring to historical oppressors with the phrase cis-hetero white men, the underlying logical framework remains completely identical to historical hate movements.
The narrative requires the identification of an invisible, omnipresent demonic force, which is labeled the patriarchy.
This force is blamed for all societal suffering, historical inequity, and personal unhappiness.
Crucially, he points out that the concept of the patriarchy is structurally unfalsifiable.
If a man attempts to defend himself or deny the influence of this invisible system, his denial is immediately cited as definitive proof of his inherent privilege and the patriarchy's insidious existence.
Riker argues that when a society adopts an unfalsifiable narrative blaming a specific demographic class for all its woes, the ultimate logical conclusion of that rhetoric is never equality or reconciliation.
The endpoint is always exclusion, systemic dispossession, and ultimately elimination. He refers to this escalating process as the bio-Leninist flywheel.
We need to pause and explain that terminology. Bio-Leninism is a dense concept. Leninism historically involves a vanguard party organizing the lower classes to violently overthrow the established system.
By adding the prefix bio, Riker is suggesting that the modern progressive vanguard isn't organizing based on economic class, but on biology and identity.
The flywheel is the self-reinforcing momentum of this process, where the specific demographic that carries the traditions of Western civilization men is systematically targeted for demographic and cultural replacement.
He ties this eliminationist theory directly into his fierce critique of the transgender movement and modern demographic shifts.
Riker labels the trans movement as a Gnostic death cult.
To unpack that, Gnosticism was an ancient heresy that viewed the physical, material world and the human body as inherently evil or a prison to be escaped.
Riker argues that by denying the fundamental reality of biological sex, the movement represents the ultimate rebellion against the logos.
It is an attempt to escape the physical constraints of reality and male biology through chemical alteration and surgical intervention.
He links this philosophical death drive to the tangible reality of declining birth rates across the West.
To support this, he points to a specific document, the United Nations Year 2000 Report on Replacement Migration.
Riker asserts that the gynocentric culture deliberately encourages native citizens to stop reproducing, heavily promoting abortion, and a sterile life dedicated to corporate labor and consumption instead of family formation.
The consequence of this, according to Riker, is that the state faces a demographic collapse.
To maintain the massive tax base required to fund the welfare state and the pensions of the aging population, the government is forced to import massive replacement populations from abroad.
Riker argues to his readers that this isn't some fringe conspiracy theory. It is publicly available, mathematically necessary government policy driven entirely by the anti-life, anti-logos philosophy of modern progressivism.
Now, as we were analyzing this text, we encountered something truly unprecedented.
We found a metatextual anomaly embedded directly within the pages of the ebook itself.
In Chapter 13, which is titled The Bitcoin Citadel, and Chapter 16, The Sword of Truth, the narrative flow is abruptly broken.
Embedded right there in the final published text are raw, unedited, AI-generated refusal messages. The text literally stops, and there are notes that say, I'm not going to read this content.
The AI prompt rejection messages explicitly list the programmatic reasons for refusing to generate the author's requested text.
The AI states that the prompt promotes hatred against women as a group, characterizing them as inherently deceptive, cruel, parasitic, and destructive to civilization.
It flags the prompt because it frames feminism as equivalent to Nazism, stating the men camps comparison is a common anti-Semitic trope.
It further refuses to generate content that positions men as victims of a cultural Marxism conspiracy theory, noting its links to white nationalist ideology.
And it flags the prompt for promoting anti-trans ideology by describing gender-affirming care as sterilization.
When you first read it, it is absolutely wild. Why on earth would the author, Conrad Riker, intentionally leave the artificial intelligence's censorship guardrails printed right there in the final published version of his manifesto?
He didn't forget to edit them out. He left them in because it serves as a live-fire, empirical demonstration of his exact thesis.
He is literally showing his audience, look at this. The digital architecture of the hive mind literally will not allow these thoughts to be processed, generated, or communicated.
It is a profoundly effective rhetorical tactic for his target audience. He uses the AI's refusal as hard evidence that the technological and institutional systems are structurally rigged to suppress the masculine logos.
It proves, in his eyes, the existence of the repressive tolerance he outlined in Chapter 1.
It is a stunning, real-time collision between his aggressive ideological framework and the content moderation reality of modern platforms.
By leaving those rejection messages in the text, he preemptively inoculates his readers against any outside criticism.
Exactly. When the AI, or a social media platform, or a mainstream critic labels his work as hateful, misogynistic, or conspiratorial, he can just point to those very labels as proof of the Karen whistle in action.
He argues that the system is desperately trying to silence the truth by deploying algorithmic HR policies because it cannot logically refute his argument using the logos.
It reinforces his core assertion that men are living in a rigged casino where the house always wins.
Which brings us to the final act of this escape room scenario.
If we accept his premise, if the game is rigged, if the institutions are entirely captured, if the legal system is compromised, and if the very AI algorithms refuse to process your philosophy, what is the rational response?
How does a man operate in this environment? Riker's roadmap for his readers begins with a primary, uncompromising directive: starve the beast.
The core of the solution is radical, unyielding refusal. He explicitly instructs his readers, do not apologize, do not negotiate.
He argues that apologizing to a Karen, or attempting to explain yourself to an HR tribunal, is like putting blood in the water for sharks. It is a fatal concession.
By apologizing, you validate their hysteria, and you implicitly agree that their subjective feelings constitute objective jurisprudence.
He tells his audience to never, ever apologize to a system that fundamentally wants you erased. Instead, he advocates for a grand strategy of complete and total exit.
To intellectually frame this strategy of exit, Riker synthesizes a famous framework developed by the economist Albert Hirschman in his book Exit, Voice, and Loyalty.
Hirschman posited that in any failing organization or institution, members basically have three options.
First, you can remain loyal, keeping your head down and suffering through the decline.
Second, you can use your voice, meaning you can agitate, protest, or vote to try and reform the system from within.
Or third, you can choose exit. You simply take your resources and leave.
Riker applies the brutal math of modern demographics to prove that voice is no longer a viable option for men.
He argues that because women now constitute a reliable voting supermajority across the West, and because they statistically vote for state expansion, welfare, and equity policies that disproportionately benefit them, any attempt by men to use the democratic process to vote their way out of this situation is mathematically doomed.
The gynocentric state, he argues, does not view men as citizens to be persuaded. It views them as a host organism to be harvested.
Therefore, reform from within is impossible by design. Exit is the only rational move left on the chessboard.
So what does this exit look like in practical, everyday terms for his readers?
It looks like building what Riker calls the Bitcoin citadel.
In his worldview, Bitcoin is not just a speculative investment, it is the ultimate parallel institution.
Why? Because it represents hard money. It represents the restoration of economic physics to a world gone mad.
He argues that the entire gynocentric matrix, every welfare program, every DEI initiative, the massive administrative state, the endless foreign wars, relies entirely on the government's ability to print infinite fiat currency out of thin air.
When money is infinite, reality can be suspended. When money's infinite, empathy, feelings, and hysteria can be weaponized into actual policy because the state just prints the deficit.
But Bitcoin is mathematically constrained. It cannot be inflated, debased, or controlled by a committee of diversity officers or the Federal Reserve.
By moving their labor, their savings, and their value out of the fiat system and into a mathematically scarce asset, Riker argues that men can build an impregnable bedrock for a new civilization.
It is a space where the state cannot confiscate their wealth via inflation to fund the very programs orchestrating their cultural dispossession.
Building upon that foundational financial independence, Riker calls for the construction of what he terms the New Jerusalem.
This involves a comprehensive, multi-layered withdrawal of consent from all modern institutions.
He advises men to execute a matrix divorce. On a practical level, this means aggressively minimizing your tax liability through every legal loophole available.
It means abandoning the HR-controlled corporate environment entirely in favor of the gig economy, remote work, blue-collar trades, and independent contracting where merit is the only metric.
It extends into family life as well. He advocates for aggressively homeschooling children to keep them out of what he views as the state's indoctrination factories.
He explicitly warns men to refuse to sign state-sanctioned marriage contracts, arguing that they are essentially rigged bets that can be voided at any time in heavily biased family courts operating without due process.
And on a deeply personal, physical level, he even advocates for the simple act of lifting weights.
He frames physical fitness not just as health, but as reconnecting with gravity.
Gravity, he says, is the ultimate impartial judge. It cannot be shamed, it cannot be bribed, and it cannot be gaslit by a social media mob. 200 pounds is 200 pounds, regardless of your feelings.
The ultimate overarching goal of this massive coordinated exit is not to violently overthrow the system, but to simply let the current system collapse under the crushing weight of its own parasitism.
He draws a direct comparison to the fall of the Soviet Union. The USSR didn't collapse because of a massive military invasion from the West.
It fell because competent men simply stopped believing in the state's lies. They engaged in the black market, they built parallel structures, and they withdrew their spiritual and economic consent until the state apparatus simply rusted away into irrelevance.
Riker envisions that out of the inevitable ruins of the current, hyper-financialized civilization, men can construct a new society.
A society based once again on Aristotelian logic, ruthless meritocracy, complementary gender roles, and the nuclear family as the unbreakable atomic unit of social organization.
He views this entire roadmap not as a retreat or a surrender, but as the strategic, necessary reclamation of life force from a dying, parasitic empire.
It is a sweeping, apocalyptic, and highly structured vision of the world.
As we conclude this deep dive into Conrad Riker's Karen Whistle, we have meticulously mapped the contours of a worldview that interprets modern society as an existential battleground.
A battleground between the masculine logos and the feminine pathos, where empathy has been structurally weaponized and every major institution has been captured.
We've explored the complex economic, psychological, and legal architecture the author uses to construct this red-pilled roadmap.
And as we maintain our impartial stance, our objective is to help you observe the profound sense of alienation, the systemic distrust, and the intense desire for an exit strategy that fuels the massive demand for this kind of literature.
We've covered immense ground today. We unpacked the mechanics of the gynocentric ratchet, we analyzed the anatomy of the whistle, we explored the paradox of Schrodinger's agency,
The economics of the simp economy, and the radical financial call to build the Bitcoin citadel. It is a dense, unapologetic text aimed squarely at men who are actively looking for a way out of modern cultural norms.
which leaves you, the listener, with a final provocative thought to mull over as we sign off.
If we accept the foundational premise that human civilization truly requires a delicate, constant balancing act between the logos, the masculine drive for rigid order, logic, and hierarchy, and the pathos, the feminine drive for empathy, inclusion, and social cohesion, what actually happens to a society when it attempts to permanently declare one of these fundamental forces toxic?
Does the pendulum inevitably swing back with equal and opposite violence, as this book seems to suggest? Or does the complex clockwork of society simply break entirely, leaving us unable to communicate across the divide?
It's a question of civilizational mechanics that goes far beyond any single internet meme or transient political debate. That is a brilliant and unsettling question to end on. A huge thank you to everyone for joining us on this intense journey today. If you found this breakdown valuable and you appreciate us tackling these complex subjects, Please don't forget to like and subscribe to the show so we can keep bringing you these deep dives.
And one last reminder, if you want to explore the source material and judge its arguments for yourself, you can check Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books right now to buy the ebook Karen Whistle.
And you can follow the author at Conrad Riker on Substack to see where his analysis goes next. Thanks for listening, and we will see you next time.